We continue with our overview of the of the newly released, newly published book, The Pursuit of Human Well-Being. As you can see, this is the book. My name is Joseph Sergi. I'm one of the editors of the book. My co-editor in this book is Richard Estes. He's the lead editor. Um, and what we'll be doing in this video, we will give the audience a sort of a feel for chapter 15 that focuses on the successor states of the former Soviet Union. The title of the chapter is Well-Being in the Transition Economies of the Successor States of the Former Soviet Union. The chapter is co-authored by by two fine individuals, Professor Carol Graham. Her exact title is the Leo Pavlovsky Senior Fellow with the Brookings Institution and College Park Professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, Maryland, the United States. And her co-author is Orion Werman, and right now she is a financial analyst in banking and supervision at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. This is in Washington, D.C., in the United States. Okay, let me read to you the sort of the introduction, and I think the introduction will give you a good feel of what the chapter is about. So allow me to read a few paragraphs in the introduction section. We examine well-being trends in the context of turbulent economic and political change in the transition and the post-transition economies of the Eastern Bloc, defined here as the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and those of the former Soviet Union that had centrally planned economies and socialist governments or were part of the former Soviet bloc before 1989. Central planning brought varying degrees of political repression, with the extreme described in the preceding quote, but also for most citizens universal guarantees of social services and economic security. With the transition, these countries experienced a fundamental restructuring of their economic, political, and social welfare systems, which led to unprecedented changes in the lives of most citizens. Although all of these countries experienced decades of centrally planned economies and political repression, they brought very different histories and institutional compositions to the Soviet era. The Eastern European countries had a longer term trajectory of markets and democracy and a shared cultural history with Europe. The countries of the former Russian Empire, meanwhile, had little experience with democracy prior to the Soviet period, although they were fairly sophisticated economically. Many of the countries of Central Asia entered the Soviet period with unprecedented, with un, I mean, sorry, underdeveloped states and markets, and some were pastoral and even nomadic societies, as in the case of Mongolia. Not surprisingly, these different experiences and economic and political trajectories result in a very different outcomes, both under central planning and during the transition. These different histories and vast internal diversity were made more complex by borders that were drawn only recently. They were all influenced by the shared experience with communist governments and central planning. Yet, because of their different starting points and different levels of prior experience with markets and democracy, they entered the transition process with different institutional capacities. For the most part, as we demonstrate, the countries that had market economies and democratic governments in the past and that were also more closely linked to Europe fared much better during the transition, although there were winners and losers within them. A theme of this chapter is the vast differences in outcomes, both across countries and the individuals within them, and the extent to which these differences are reflected in well-being indicators. Although they are diverse and in different countries, the vast majority of citizens lived in societies that lacked political and economic freedoms, but provided guaranteed access to basic public goods such as health and education and, and universal, if not always full, fulfilling employment to all citizens. The transition to market economies and political freedom was as abrupt as it was dramatic, and those countries that had prior experience with markets and democracy were in a better position to manage it, whereas the particularly vulnerable groups within all countries, such as the elderly, had the most difficult time coping. The effects of these complex changes on the lives of ordinary citizens are reflected in both objective indicators of economic progress, such as the gross national product per capita, income inequality, and unemployment rates, and in subjective well-being metrics such as life satisfaction and satisfaction with jobs, standard of living, and public goods. The latter metrics attempt to measure the various dimensions of well-being that extend beyond income. We provide to the extent we can an analysis of both. Objective and subjective indicators of progress tend to run in the same direction, yet there are, at times, differences between them. The chapter covers the period between from 1990s through 2012 and uses data from a number of sources, including the World Development Indicators and the World Value Survey, and the Gallup World Poll, and the Life and Transition Survey. Our analytical approach is based in the new science of well-being. Scholars from a range of disciplines, including economics and psychology, are now using well-being metrics to explore the effects of environmental, institutional, and policy variables on well-being. We are, of course, attempting to draw broad conclusions about a tremendously diverse group of countries, and we will inevitably miss important differences across specific countries. And to make more meaningful comparison, we split the transition countries into two groups, European Union and non-EU. The broad assumption being that those that have been accepted in the EU have made more complete economic and political transitions. Okay, I think that I feel that the introduction gives you a sense, should give you a sense of what the chapter is about. And on that note, I will stop here.